Thank you very much, Professor Hessle, for your very comprehensive presentation full of morally and maybe or even theologically conflict questions. And now I open the discussion. The first one is our Chancellor, please.
I asked the same thing that I asked to Monsignor when he speak about this. What is the hierarchy of your principles? Because you make a great confusion, to say the truth. And then the Constitution, the non-Constitution, but what are you put also natural law, what are the criteria? Because we need to establish some criteria basic for the question of refugees. Is the Constitution? I think it's not the Constitution, but this is a question.
Well, thank you very much. I have dealt with these issues quite in extenso in my book, Morals and Paradox, which I presuppose as a framework. So, first of all, I do think that there's an autonomous moral realm. And in the autonomous moral realm, one of the basic questions is, what are our duties toward those who need help? And I've mentioned 3 criteria as moral criteria, which allow us to select. Because to say we have to help all persons doesn't help anybody, nobody can do it. We cannot help all persons. We have to develop strategies that are inclusive, that in the long term will bring everybody, not in the long term, hopefully in 20 years, will bring everyone.
It's not all the world, are the refugees that are only this.
Moment. The refugees are a special case of people in need. I do not accept the idea that the refugees are the only group of persons in need. And in fact, when you have to do budgetary allocations, several countries have, like the Netherlands, have reduced their developmental aid in order to help refugees. This is a moral decision that has to be decided. So I try to develop general principle on the ethics of helping applied to the refugees aspect. Second, I'm not a jurist, but I do think that it is good that we have a legal framework. Legal framework is something that binds states. International treaties bind states even if they interpret them creatively. And therefore, I found it my duty, even if I am a philosopher, to make the work, and I need long time for that, to study all these treaties. I've read them all thoroughly, looking at commentaries to see what are the issues at stake. Now, of course, this work does not replace the work of the ethicist. However, if I want to understand what is going on in the reality and why states act in a certain way, I should be better familiar with that. I belong to the persons who think, for example, that every ethicist should read the Charter of the United Nations, not because all what is written in the Charter of the United Nations is morally wise or good, but because it is a very important document that explains the behavior of states to each other. So the second part was to look at what is the legal framework that we have achieved. At the same time, I try to say what is not satisfying in the framework. And I have mentioned several criteria that I regard as practically plausible, that I understand why people came to that compromise, but I said we have to go beyond that. So that is then an attempt to try to go beyond the positive law based on moral principles. And third, there is this explicitly political dimension. What is meant by political dimension? When you make a decision, the decision, if you don't have an autocratical system, and even in an autocratical system, every autocrat knows that he can be overthrown, and therefore is well advised to look at some form of the reaction of the people around him, you have to try to garner consensus. And my question is, why was Germany at the beginning remarkable in this Willkommenskultur, but why did it not last as long as I would like it to last? And I mentioned several problematic aspects of Merkel's decision. And again, I personally do think it's very important that parliaments control executives. That is, for me, not simply a fact of our constitution, but it's a morally very reasonable point. I believe in the dependency of the executive on parliaments, but it's also a fact of our constitution. And I find it irritating that Merkel did not we did not go to the parliament and say, we are in this crisis, please vote for that. That she should have done. And the fact that she didn't do it was one of the reasons why the support began to go away. If she had held a great speech to the nation, had gone to the parliament, asked for permission, I think the German support would have lasted longer. This is now a question of analysis. How do we get support for political decisions, and I try to understand why it didn't last as long as I would like to. And the same thing is, I do think that Michael is right from a moral point of view to say we have a duty to help people who flee from Syria within the European Union. However, I say it's not likely that you can expect other people about whom you have to have realistic moral assumptions, even if you try to live a demanding moral life, that they will step in once you have already taken them in. If I take a lot of people in my house, I can then not knock at my neighbor and say, please take them in too. I should first go to them and say, I will take in a large amount if you also are willing to cooperate. And then it's more likely that she would have gotten the other European states on board. And the crucial issue, of course, I criticize, what I presented here is only half of what I've written. I criticize the Schengen regime. But what is clear is that the lack of internal borders within the European Union or between the Schengen members of the European Union can only work if the external borders function. As long as we do not have internal borders of the European Union, it is a threat to the other countries if another country lets persons in that then can go, because there are no borders, to the neighboring countries. That was the reaction of the other countries. And the reaction was predictable. And again, Marcello, to say it as clear as possible, I do think, all my books, I think, show it quite clearly, that politics can have only dignity if it is inspired by moral principles. However, great politicians are not simply abstract moralists. They try to understand the legal frameworks that exist and that are very powerful tools in order to achieve things.
Sorry.
They understand the political necessities.
I want a hierarchy. Accepted refugees at different levels. One level is to give it. The other level is to give work. The other level is to recognize some kind of citizen or the title.
Yeah.
There are different levels that it's impossible not recognize this level.
Yeah, I think I understand now your question better. It is a question that is in fact...
Dear Professor Hessler, please, I understand very well you are defending your presentation with great enthusiasm. Nevertheless, the collegial the dialogue is something different. So, open up space for other questions, please. So, second one is our President, Margaret Archer, please.
Vittorio, I very much liked your 3 criteria that you started off from. I can live with those. I wish more nations worked with them. However, I do not like the bunching together of people in need under the term refugees. They are not all synonymous. Some meet your 3 criteria better than others. In particular, trafficked persons meet all 3, and it's there in the UN Palermo Convention of 2002, the start of, well, not quite the start of the definition of the traffic, that goes to the ILO, but the building in of voluntarism, or its lack, that is definitional of a trafficked person. It's not necessarily definitional of a whole host of other refugees. So, top of the list, my list for ethical, humane recognition and acceptance would go to trafficked persons, even over others, such as many of the Syrian refugees, who have indeed and undeniably suffered terribly. But at least their decision to become an asylum seeker rather than to stay at home. And as you pointed out in your paper, there are governments like my own, I disapprove of it, but still, who say, oh, we're taking so few asylum seekers because we're making such great investments back in Syria and other places, that, you know, that absolves us of any need to take more than, what is it, John, 5,000 people by 2020, which is minuscule.
Microphone, please.
So I prefer to organize a discussion. If I can, may I add other two intervention to your one? Margaret, may I add other two intervention? So, please, Professor Carrozza.
I'll be very brief. First, Vittorio, I want to congratulate you for fitting more words into a 30-minute presentation than I thought humanly possible. So, Madam President, I would like to propose a bonus for the interpreters for their work for today. I imagine they'll need at least a change of clothes after this session. More seriously, I have a question also about the three basic principles that you use at the foundation of it, because absent from them is anything that resembles, if I understand correctly, anything that resembles what Jeremy Waldron, for example, has been trying to propose and develop lately as a principle of proximity. Which I think ties what you've done to what Russ presented about a housed existence and sharing a common life. I mean, shouldn't there be also somewhere in there a certain priority simply in virtue of who is in front of us, of who is present in our communities as well, such that the consequentialist calculation of who I might benefit most but who might be distant from me isn't always enough in order to determine the kinds of ethical obligations I have to the trafficked person or the refugee or whoever else who happens to be in community with me, in fact, physically and materially right now. And obviously, at a practical level, this is hugely relevant to the question of how we deal with refugees in irregular status in the United States right now.
Please. To answer to both very short answer, please.
Thank you so much. I will think more about it, Margaret, in which sense trafficked persons have a peculiar status among refugees, and I think you have mentioned a very important argument that they have been victim of a specific violence, while the refugees have made their decision on their own. I do not know enough, even if I participate in a splendid conference on trafficked person, and I'm very, very thankful for your work in having it integrated in the goals of the United Nations that we should abolish human trafficking. I cannot tell you how many of the persons who are trafficked are in fact at the beginning coming under deception. So there would be still a difference whether someone is simply taken more or less with force or allured under false promises. Probably that would also make a certain moral distinction in treating them. But I think it is plausible to say that this special group enjoys a preferential treatment. So I'm in agreement with you. I'm not, however, Paolo, really in agreement with the criterion. I'm in agreement with the criterion on a practicality point of view and also in my own more emotional response. But I confess that I am a stubborn rationalist in ethics. I think moral emotions are important, but it is important that they are subjected to scrutiny. And the main argument that I would use against you is the following. Several of the people who came to Germany from Syria were in fact quite well off. Because they could afford for the persons who paid, they could pay the persons who brought them over. And for me, it's not obviously evident that the person who has the means to come to Germany and knock at our doors deserves more help than the person in the tents in Lebanon who do not get basic schooling, minimal food, etc. It's not an obvious thing for me. I agree that it is natural that we react to the person who manages to come to our house, but I'm not 100% sure that the physical proximity is a moral criterion. That has to do with my strong universalist Kantian rationalist framework.
Yeah. Thank you for your response. And now I recommend 3 interventions. Saburen, Reichberg, Gonzalez, please.
Monsieur le Président. Your turn will come up. Professor Caruso thanked the translators, I think, for one time since the beginning of this assembly. I'm going to speak French because I'm so touched by what you said. Monsieur le Président, j'ai entendu dans ma carrière internationale beaucoup d'allocutions portant sur les réfugiés et d'autres, mais je ne dissimulerai point que c'est une des rares fois que je suis extrêmement plus proche, que je suis personnellement interpellé par ce que vient de dire le professeur Holt. Je suis impressionné par, je dirais d'abord, sa passion, son émotion, ses convictions et je dirais même son érudition. Parce que ceux d'entre nous qui vont alterner entre la vie professorale et la vie internationale dans la pratique, nous sommes très impressionnés par les gens qui connaissent la littérature. Et évidemment, on connaît bien Grotius, que vous avez mentionné, on connaît bien Kant, on connaît surtout pour les plus jeunes James Hathaway, on sait qui est John Rawls, on sait qui sont toute une série, je dirais, d'écrivains, de philosophes, de théoriciens, non seulement du droit, mais de la pratique. Mais c'est la première fois que j'entends des références au sujet de Platon, au sujet de Sophocle, au sujet d'Euripide, et que j'entends parler en ce qui a trait aux réfugiés d'Électra, d'Agamemnon. Donc, vous avez une capacité, je dirais, de présenter de façon très claire, d'une part, mais de façon très érudite, le sujet qui portait sur les réfugiés. Vous connaissez bien les conventions sur le sujet. Vous donnez beaucoup d'exemples, dont un qui m'est particulièrement cher parce que je suis allé sur place pour constater, c'est le cas des Rohingyas au Myanmar. Et nous sommes, comme je le disais hier, tellement préoccupés par ce qui se passe chez nous, dans nos pays actuellement, que nous oublions très souvent qu'il y a des centaines et des centaines de groupes de réfugiés ailleurs, surtout dans les pays du tiers-monde, dont on parle beaucoup moins. Il faut aller en Australie pour comprendre comment les réfugiés en Australie ont une situation qui est très, très particulière. On va les parquer dans une île en face. Et les pays européens vivent maintenant des difficultés très grandes. Et si j'avais le temps, je vous parlerais de l'expérience fascinante que nous vivons maintenant au Canada, qui est très particulière. Nous avons accueilli 50 000 réfugiés l'an dernier et nous venons maintenant de prendre des décisions très importantes sur ce que nous ferons avec ces 50 000 réfugiés qui sont arrivés depuis un an. Alors, je vais...
Pardon, professeur Sabourin, est-ce que je vous demander aller vers la question,
voilà.
S'il vous plaît.
Oui, je vous en prie. Vous avez parfaitement raison. vos opinions sur ce qui se passe en Europe, moi je trouve, sont très valides. Et la constatation que l'on doit faire, c'est que, en ce qui a trait aux droits des réfugiés, et je partage le point de vue de Margaret en ce qui a trait qu'il faut faire toutes les distinctions nécessaires entre migrants, réfugiés, enfin de grandes catégories, c'est de dire que peut-être nous sommes en face d'un problème où le droit se fait devant nous, hein. Nous sommes en présence d'un droit évolutif, mais d'un droit qui est de plus en plus conspué et non appliqué. Nous savons tous que la Convention de Bellagio, la Convention de Genève, oblige les pays qui l'ont signée à un certain nombre de responsabilités. Mais nous savons fort bien que ce n'est pas ce que l'on fait. Et on n'avait qu'à écouter le Premier ministre de Hongrie il y a quelques jours pour comprendre qu'on est en train de justifier l'injustifiable. Oui. Alors, je voudrais connaître votre opinion là-dessus.
Yeah. Maintenant, Professor Reichsberg, please.
Thanks. Actually, I just want to express some skepticism about the point that Margaret Archer made, that trafficked persons ought to get precedence over asylum seekers. And the reason I have a doubt about this is the foundation that you pointed to, I think would be a correct one, is that abstractly considered is that the one category has no choice and the other has a choice. But it's precisely that I have a doubt about. And, you know, in Norway, anyone seeking asylum from Syria is automatically accepted, you know, provided you get to Norway. It's simply if you can demonstrate that you're a Syrian. Whereas asylum seekers from other countries, they've got to demonstrate that their lives were in danger wherever they're coming from, Iran and so forth. Now, why is Syria singled out in this way? And I know a little bit about it because my wife works for the immigration agency, and she spent all last year interviewing Syrian asylum seekers. The people who have managed to escape have done so under threat of their lives. These are people many have been tortured. I mean, and to say that that's a choice, that you could have comfortably stayed at home or with some anxiety, that's just not the case for most of these people. And so, you know, in the law, action under duress is considered to be action that's not fully chosen. I mean, choice is vastly reduced. So I just don't know whether we want to make that differentiation. The trafficked person may actually not be under threat of death. You know, terrible things are happening to the trafficked person. But being under threat of death I think there's something significant there.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks. And third one, Professor Gonzalez, please. Very shortly, please, very shortly. Time is galloping.
Yes, I will be very short, don't worry. Yeah. At some point, Vittorio, you said that we have first to repay our debts before we can begin to think about being generous. Well, this is not always the case. I remind you of Aristotle in the book on friendship. At some point, he says, generally the debt should be paid, but if the gift is exceedingly noble or exceedingly necessary, one should defer to these considerations. I think that that's the case not only for Aristotle, but also for other moral philosophers. And the second point, well, the issue of how should we structure our duties towards strangers, so to speak. Well, in my view, and this is more on Humean grounds, our moral duties towards strangers are structured somewhat artificially, and the state is such an artifice. And the present situation, what brings to light is the fact that perhaps the state is no longer up to the task of structuring our debts towards strangers. Perhaps it still is useful for structuring some needs, but not others. So the real point would be to find ways of structuring those other debts, because there is a moral primacy here, and then we should create the institutional arrangements necessary to be up to that duty, so to speak.
Thanks. Now there is a room for your responses for last three. Yeah, I know. And now response for three last interventions, and last one intervention of Professor Dasgupta is the end of this session.
Well, thank you very much for the questions. I begin with your question because it was not directed to me, but to Margaret, so I would like then to hear Margaret's answer to your question. I think she's more addressed by you. Then I thank you so much, Professor Sabourin, for your very generous remarks. You are completely right. What we are witnessing, for example, in Hungary is scandalous. And it is a very, very deep crisis, not only simply of disagreements between the member states of the European Union, but it is a challenge of the basic values. We had a discussion during the refugee crisis between some German politicians and some people from the Slovakia, Hungary, the Visegrad states. And the position was like this. The Visegrad states is we accept only contractual obligations. There are no contractual obligations for the other countries to accept refugees. That is against the Dublin Agreement. And the German side said we are a value community.
Sorry, Professor Hessler, please. I see that you will be unable to answer to first one intervention because we have 3 minutes.
Yeah, I think I will be. So the question was then, are we a value community? And the answer is yes, we have also certain common values, and one has the impression that Hungary is distancing itself very dramatically from these values. So yes, I'm very worried. Now to Anna Marta's question. I agree with you, Anna Marta. Of course, you can postpone paying your debts in order to satisfy an immediate need. However, I do think that you cannot in good conscience defect on your debts. You can try to say, I pay later, but you must have a reasonable, for me, frankly, the idea to die without having paid my debts is horrific. But to postpone them in order to do morally more urgent things is completely fine. That would be the compromise with regard to you. And you are, of course, also right that in order to get people morally active, you need a set of institutions. And the great problem is that we do not have international institutions that are as deeply grounded as, for example, states, and that this makes it so difficult to fulfill our duties towards migrants and refugees.
Perhaps Professor Reichsberg's intervention, do you have some?
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, no, I think Professor Masha
okay.
answer because fundamentally...
So, thank you. Now, last intervention of Professor Dasgupta, please, also very shortly, please.
Sorry, this is not really as much an intervention. This is a very emotive issue that we've been discussing this last paper. I'm just going to effectively quote, refer to people who know more about this than I do, people who have been working on the development field and extreme poverty and immigration, distress immigration, who have argued that there is a self-selection process in the refugee. We observe there's a visceral aspect to observing people in deep distress arriving at your border. But on the other hand, of course, there are people in deep distress who haven't been able to leave for one reason or the other. And the suggestion, it's not my suggestion, but it's something we probably want to take more seriously, that maybe it will be more effective if the recipient countries were to forestall the immigration by establishing really serious, well-preserved, catered to camps in safe zones, so that would include more people than are able to escape, and at a lower cost, of course, because the expenses are cheaper. It's an argument that has been provided by people like Paul Collier. I don't know how they add up, but it's something perhaps we ought to think about when we talk about the refugee crisis.
I completely agree. Thank you.